I'm going to explain how I help the students make sense of the different properties in math. And so the first one that we're going to look at is the commutative property of both addition and multiplication. So what I use is I make up a story that Mr. Jolliffe and his family are going to go to Disney World. So in Mr. Jolliffe's family, there's 4 of us. And Mr. Ansley and his family are also going to go to Disney World. And in Mr. Ansley's family, there's 5. And so let's say that on Monday, Mr. Jolliffe's family leaves first, and then the next day, Mr. Ansley's family leaves. So what we can do is we can see that, well, for Mr. Jolliffe's family, that there were 4, and for Mr. Ansley's, there were 5. Now, let's say that, what if we reversed it? Let's say, what if Mr. Ansley's family left on Monday first, and then on Tuesday, Mr. Jolliffe's family left? Okay. Would that matter in terms of how many people ended up or went to Disney World together? And so here, we'll see that Mr. Ansley's family and then Mr. Jolliffe's family. So when we add, well, Mr. Jolliffe's family and Ansley's families together, we'll see that 9 people ended up in Disney World for the first scenario. And let's see if that will equal if Mr. Ansley's family left first for the second scenario. And what we'll see is that it doesn't matter which way we add, that we end up with the same amount. And so the reason I kind of use this example is then that we look at the word commute. And so we kind of look at that, what does that mean? While commute means to travel to work, so rather than explaining that we're going to work, well, now our families we're commuting to Disney World. So now looking at the associative property, well, what I do is I add another person to the story. And so now let's say that, well, we have Mr. Jolliffe and Mr. Ansley. They're still going to Disney World, but now Mr. Hahn also wants to join. Well, Mr. Hahn doesn't want to drive by himself, so what he's gonna do is he's gonna pick who he rides with, or who he associates himself with on the ride. And so we can see we want to know is, well, let's say in the first scenario that Mr. Hahn rides with Mr. Jolliffe's family. And then in the second scenario, let's say that Mr. Hahn rides with Mr. Ansley's family. Right? Will we still end up with the same number of people at Disney World? So let's go ahead and represent. There's 4 for Mr. Jolliffe and 1 for Mr. Ansley. And then, so what we'll see is that in Mr. Jolliffe's car that there were a total of 5 people. So we can add 4 plus 1, which is 5, plus 5, and so we end up with, there's 10 people that went to Disney World when Mr. Hahn rode with the Jolliffe family. And so looking at the other scenario, we have 4 people from Mr. Jolliffe's family, and then Mr. Hahn rides with Mr. Ansley's family. And so what we'll see now is we can add 1 and 5 together first, and so that in Mr. Ansley's van there were 6 people, and then in Mr. Jolliffe's there were still 4, and then we end up with 10 people. And what we'll see is that it doesn't matter as long as we're adding who Mr. Hahn rides with, because we'll still end up with the same number of people. And then lastly, what we're going to do is we're just going to make sense of the identity property. And so looking at the addition first, all we need to do is to make sense of it, we need to ask ourselves, well, what number can I add to 4 and it still equal 4? And so by knowing our math facts, well, we know that, well, I can add 0 to 4. And then looking over at the multiplication, we can ask ourselves, what number can I multiply 4 by and still be left with 4? And so we can see that, well, 4 times 1 is 4. And there's a big misconception when we look at the identity property or the 0 property, because a lot of times students will think that the 0 property is the actual identity property for addition, and here's why. So what the 0 property of multiplication means is that, well, if I have 4 groups, or 4 times 0, 4 groups of 0, we are left with 0. And so a lot of times students kind of look at that 0 property and they know that, well, 4 plus 0 is 4, and so they think that just because this 0 is here that it's the 0 property. But what we're actually asking is what can I multiply? What number can I multiply by and always be left with 0?